Okay, so we've got 1 minute to go. I think you guys won't mind if we get started early. My name is Sean C.W. Korsgaard. I'm a U.S. Army veteran, award-winning photojournalist, and most recently, junior editor and media manager at Baen Books, a speculative fiction publisher. And in this case, I am a Fire Emblem fan for going on a decade now. But before we dive too much into this program, like I said, I'm going to be giving away books and snacks to all of you beautiful people who spent your waning hours at MAGFest staring at my ugly face. But first, let's see who's earned them before they have to answer a few questions. Show of hands, anyone in here a veteran of the United States military? Okay. Is anyone in here a cosplayer? Come on up, grab a book and a snack. You guys make MAGFest a hell of a lot more fun and more colorful, quite literally. There we go. Now, again, who here is their first time at MAGFest? Wow, there are a lot of you. Come on up, grab a book and a snack. Because after all, we want you coming back happy. And hopefully coming to more of my panels in the future. Now, the rest of you, you'll have to actually earn some of the goodies, but don't worry, you'll have your chance, and if you don't, well, let's just say I'm not carrying an entire box of hardback books back to my car. So, this is Together We Ride, a celebration and history of the Fire Emblem franchise. Last MAGFest, it had just turned 30. Things are a bit different now, but the games are still as classic as they ever are. But let's ask ourselves, what is Fire Emblem, and why do we love it? Is it a white-knuckle tactical RPG franchise that in its prime redefined the very definition of Nintendo hard? One of the best works of epic high fantasy in all of video gaming, the equal of anything in the genre and even much that's on the bookshelves. A glorified dating sim that lets you date pretty anime boys and girls. Blow on their face to increase their affinity. Fire Emblem is the original tactical RPG franchise. They were actually the first. Everything else that came after, be it Advanced Wars, XCOM, all came after Fire Emblem. So that is something notable and interesting to celebrate. They were developed by Intelligent Systems after tinkering around with a couple other ideas. But depending on if you count the mobile games, spin-off titles, that weird Persona crossover that's its own bag of something, there have been either 13, 16, or 19 games in the franchise. So for a 30-year span, that's pretty prolific. Which brings us to the first trivia question. Okay, guess the answer's on there. But which work of Western fantasy... Oh, that's actually just a hint. Which work of Western high fantasy helped inspire the original Fire Emblem? Hint, the author was Terry Brooks. Come on, we gotta have some volunteers. Yes.
Shannara?
You got it, come on up, grab yourself a book. It was the original Sword of Shannara by Terry Brooks, which had just been translated into Japanese and actually took the Japanese RPG market by storm. A lot of the 80s fantasy titles were being translated in Japan at the time. And you can see their influence everywhere from Fire Emblem to Final Fantasy, even The Legend of Zelda, where Ganon took on the form of the Warlock Lord from Shannara. And that's always been one of the things that's made Fire Emblem a fairly unique franchise, is the fact that compared to many other JRPGs, which pull their influences from predominantly tabletop games, Fire Emblem has always pulled more strictly from history, mythology, high fantasy. And part of that is the interests of the original developers. Yes, it has some of that familiar JRPG flavor, but it's different in a lot of ways. It pulls closer to Ultima and other Western RPGs at the time. And a big part of that was the creator of Fire Emblem, Shozu Kaga, affectionately known by the Japanese fanbase as Kaga-san. Now, to give you an idea of how big of a figure he is in Japan, that lovely black and white photo with him on the left, the gentleman on the right is the creator of Final Fantasy. So he is on the Mount Rushmore of JRPG developers. If not the Washington, at least the Jefferson or Roosevelt. He was a lifelong fan of Western mythology, high fantasy, and classical history, and you can see this very early on in the franchise. Mark, for example, before we translated his name wrong in Smash Brothers, was actually named Mars in Japan. All of the character names are pulled from Arthurian mythology, Celtic mythology, German history, occasionally fantasy novels. And he pulled from that in part because he'd first developed if not a tactical RPG, a tactical game that was more based on real-world combat, Famicom Wars. And after tossing a few ideas out with the developers, including an early prototype that would have set a tactical RPG in something similar to Desert Storm, we instead got Fire Emblem. Some of the other early designers, and this is important to the franchise, you had the game designer Toru Nakahiro, Daisuke Iruzawa, the character designer. He's important because one of the unique things about Fire Emblem early on is that compared to Final Fantasy, which had those beautiful ink paintings of the characters that looked like something pulled out of a museum, I see some nodding, Fire Emblem didn't have that budget. They hired guys who worked in manga. So you got those anime-influenced characters that you'd see in some games like Chrono Trigger, pretty much anything Toriyama worked on, but it was a unique difference from a lot of JRPGs that helped set Fire Emblem apart from some of the competition. And of course, you had the early musical compositions, most famously the theme, Together We Ride. The Kaga era was defined by a number of factors. The first, bone-crushing difficulty. Even in an era that Nintendo was infamous for creating some of the hardest video games on the home console market, Fire Emblem pushed that to another level. These were very difficult games to beat, still are, and a big part of that were some of the mechanics. The big one, of course, being Permadeath, Fog of War, and various other developments, but all in all, we had 5 games from the Kaga era. Show of hands, who can name one of them?
Genealogy of the Holy War.
Oh, a man of culture, I see. Coming up, grab a snack and a book.
Mystery of the Emblem.
Coming up, grab a book and a snack.
Racy of 776.
Oh, we have a masochist in here.
That's me.
Well, coming up, grab a book and a snack. Let's see. There were 5 games in this era. The first one was Fire Emblem Shadow of the Dragon and the Blade of Light. The second, Fire Emblem Gaiden, which some of us got to experience when they finally brought it over a couple years back as Shadows of Valentia. The remake of the first game, Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem. Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War, which we will talk more about in a bit. And I see someone in cosplay. You look marvelous. Coming up, grab a snack and a book. Cosplayers get a free... Come on. Hey, you're here. That's what matters. And I am not carrying them back to my car, so please. And Fire Emblem Thracia 776, which we will also talk about a little bit. But I would like to talk about what I think is probably the best game of the era, and if not one of the best games in the franchise, Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War. This was where everything from the Kaga era really began to hit its stride. The mechanics were well polished, the graphics were the best they'd been for so far, and it also introduced a lot of new mechanics that became staples or at least favorites of the franchise. This was the first game to introduce child characters. This had the weapon triangle. And of course, it had a plot line that rivaled anything in gaming, anything on the store shelves that didn't shy away from controversy. It literally centers on a religious conflict that results in multiple genocides and wars between kingdoms, as well as some other aspects of the plot that would come back to bite it, but we'll get to those bits in a moment. But let's just say it was the Game of Thrones of the SNES era for a couple of reasons. Now, you might be asking yourself, these games were great. Anyone who's played them knows they're great. They were very popular in Japan. Why didn't we get them? Why haven't we still gotten them? And there are a couple reasons behind that. The first, for whatever reason, Nintendo seems to think that we Americans don't like RPGs. They were not the only ones to have this mindset, but everybody for some reason thought that. You'd get the occasional Final Fantasy game, occasionally something like Tales of Phantasia would come over, but for the most part, they didn't. We missed out on a lot of gems. Only half of the Final Fantasy games were actually brought over here. We missed out on Terranigma, Star Ocean, dozens of classics just because the conventional wisdom at the time was Americans don't play RPGs. This was something that would really stick around for most of the early gaming period until Pokemon and Final Fantasy VII really killed that misconception for good. So Fire Emblem had that working against it. They also had the difficulty. Again, Fire Emblem redefined the phrase Nintendo hard. They were considered some of the hardest games Nintendo's ever made. Thracia 776 is actually considered the hardest Nintendo game ever made. And even by Fire Emblem standards, it's grueling. One of my favorite moments in the game, and by favorite, I mean the part I couldn't get past until I may or may not have used some cheating, is a mission where you are thrown into a dungeon, no weapons, no reinforcements, and you have to make your way out by sacrificing the other prisoners. That is Fire Emblem in a nutshell, making you make the hard choices and haunting you for ages afterward. But that difficulty was part of the reason Nintendo didn't think we Yanks could handle Fire Emblem. But of course, there was the other reason. There was actually a very brief window in the mid-90s where Genealogy: The Holy War was almost brought to the United States, until the localization team got to do a deep dive into it. And when I said it was the Game of Thrones of Fire Emblem, incest. There is lots and lots of incest core to the plot. And if you think this is just hyperbole, this is... And again, you have to dig through fan forums and magazines at the time. Apparently the localization team was so horrified by the discovery, they just torpedoed it right there. It's hilarious, if sad, because, again, one of the best games in the franchise, but at the same time, you can just imagine some of the suits at Nintendo of America having their wigs literally blow off, seeing some of the plot lines. But why does that matter to us today? The big one is, of course, you still cannot legally play any of these games. The only way you could is if you were one of the lucky few who grabbed a copy of the first game, a very loose translation, in the 30-day window Nintendo deigned to sell it to any of us. Now, there are existing translations for each of these games. Fans have offered them to Nintendo pro bono. The one for Thracia 776 took years of fan development to create, and for whatever reason, Nintendo still has dug in their heels and refused to allow us to buy them. Now, we here at MAGFest do not condone piracy, but there are certain ways you can find the games if you want. Savvy? However, this is where things take a briefly sad turn. Kaga and Nintendo had a, I guess, significant disagreement. Nintendo actually ended up, depending on who you ask, either he left of his own accord to do his own thing, they fired him, or they just had a parting of ways. Kaga left Intelligent Systems, founded his own development company. He had a game on the PlayStation called Tearing Saga, which was mostly okay, unless you're the lawyers at Nintendo, which then promptly sued the crap out of him. And he would not make another game until a few years back, where he released Vesteria Saga, which is available on Steam. Phenomenal game. There's a sequel and or spin-off coming out later this year. I highly recommend it if anyone wants to try a little bit of that old school Fire Emblem flair without having to sail the digital high seas. Now, in America, culturally, we'd begun to change. This was the start of the massive boom in fantasy that started after the multi-billion-dollar success of the Lord of the Rings movies, the Harry Potter novels, Aragon, so that at once, RPGs and fantasy-influenced things were a lot more marketable to the general public at large. as I said, Lord of the Rings just became the highest grossing franchise in history. Harry Potter continued to sell millions and millions and millions of copies. And Pokemon and Final Fantasy had finally broken down the stereotype that we would not play RPGs. This was also when anime really started taking off in the United States. Toonami made a lot of action shows really popular in the United States. This is when Dragon Ball Z, Pokemon, Sailor Moon became household names. So something that was influenced by anime and art style probably would find very fertile ground here. That said, the environment was right. The market was there. Fire Emblem still needed an introduction because nobody knew what it was in America. It needed the right place to be introduced to American gamers, and it got one of the biggest platforms in the history of video games. 7 million of them, in fact. Super Smash Bros. Melee. I think, raise your hands if you played Melee. You do my heart well. I was so afraid we'd have a lot of young people in here and my knees would start to hurt. But I think we all remember that first time playing through Melee when the character unlock screen popped up and suddenly you see an anime sword boy charging at Captain Falcon or Pikachu, and you're like, who the heck is this guy? And much by design, this was America's first introduction to Fire Emblem. Sakurai actually had to fight not to remove Marth and Roy from the games. They were put in for the Japanese edition because Marth is considered one of the main Nintendo characters and Roy had just had his Game Boy Advance game dropped in Japan. Nintendo of America actually thought they should be cut from the game because, well, who would want to play as some anime characters from games they've never heard of? Sakurai proved wise, though, and in a way that's because he is probably the biggest fan of Fire Emblem in the world. He has produced every single Fire Emblem game since Melee dropped. Kaga may have created Fire Emblem, but Sakurai is the one that shared it with the world, and for that, we owe the man a tremendous debt. And why we shouldn't be angry at him the next time he introduces 8 or 9 new Fire Emblem characters to the game. Some people say that's too many. I say it's a good start. Which leads us to the American first introduction to the franchise and the next period of franchise history, the Gba Game Boy Era. The mechanics mostly remained unchanged because by this point Fire Emblem was a well-oiled machine in terms of how the games worked. You had some changes for the international release, the big one being they really made the games a little easier for international audiences. The Lin levels were a tutorial created just for American gamers because, well, the damn Yankees may get the games, but darn it if we're going to let them think it's too hard. We'll hold their hands to the first 10 levels. But it was very successful. So, let's see a show of hands. Who can name one of the 3 protagonists of Fire Emblem, the Blazing Blade? If you've already gotten one, hands down, but we'll start with you. Come on up, get a book and a snack. You. Hector, come on up. Last one. Come on up, get a book and a snack. Lyn, Eliwood, and Hector were the first heroes we were really introduced to with Fire Emblem, and that's a really odd thing, because this game was a prequel to one that still hasn't been released in the United States. Fire Emblem The Binding Blade, which all of us know as the game Roy came from. Now, to put it simply why that is so odd, imagine, if you will, that you've never heard of Star Wars, and your introduction is The Phantom Menace. That is kind of the situation that Japanese fans who've been here from the beginning look at us as Fire Emblem fans. Oh man, I love the prequels! Well, have you watched these originals? No, I can't legally buy them! And we are missing out. Binding Blade is a phenomenal game, and I do love Blazing Blade. But we had a lot of very good games in this period, and I think that was part of why it found such a devoted early fan base in the United States. You had, of course, Binding Blade, which we never got, Blazing Blade, which we did, Sacred Stones, a dear personal favorite of mine, and I see it has some fans, but the GameCube games were where it really began to shine, with Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. Who here had that as their introduction to the franchise? couple hands, okay. Now, the game follows the Grell mercenaries, and of course, Ike, who we like, as they navigate a war across Tellius and the racial and political strife plaguing the continent. This was, more than the Game Boy games, I think America's first introduction to all the stuff that made Fire Emblem such a huge hit in Japan. It tackled stuff like racism, war, bigotry, classism, that few other RPGs ever managed to, and did so with a deft of touch that many of them lack. And of course, this was probably the first game with Western tastes in mind. Ike is probably the first protagonist in series history designed to appeal to us, because he's the first one who isn't a noble. He's actually a commoner, a mercenary. And that was designed for the Republican sensibilities of the greater Western world, as opposed to Japan that tends to like their princes and princesses fighting with swords. And of course, it was the first, one of the few actually, to get a direct sequel with Radiant Dawn, although that would have some troubles of its own. The big one being it didn't sell very well, resulting in it being the last console release until Three Houses. And it also led into the dark age for the franchise. Part of this was Nintendo was having its own problems. The Wii, although selling very well, was not a game mover, a few Legend of Zelda and Mario games aside. You had a couple of Fire Emblem games in this period. None of them sold particularly well. Of course, the logical reason is they were remakes, lazy ones at that. One of them literally reused the sprites from some of the Game Boy games. But of course, suits have to be suits, and Nintendo thought that, well, maybe there just isn't an appetite for more Fire Emblem games. So, they came with a directive to Intelligent Systems, as they did to many of their other franchises struggling at the time. This was, of course, when we stopped getting Golden Sun games, F-Zero games, Star Fox games. This was the period that killed a lot of Nintendo franchises. And Intelligent Systems had their marching orders. Your next game sells 250,000 copies, or it's the last Fire Emblem game. Naturally, they panicked. It's do or die time. What the heck do we do? And they drew up some really wild ideas that, while interesting, I'm glad they didn't go with. A particular favorite of mine is one that would have had a Fire Emblem game set in Afghanistan. Yeah, they actually planned to have a Fire Emblem game set in the modern War on Terror. I don't know how that would work.
Wouldn't this be like a more darker version of Forest?
See? That's what fascinates me. Compelling. But instead, they chose a different route. They took everything people loved about the franchise, bundled it together, and turned that notch up to 11. It could have been the last stand of the franchise, and instead, it was a renaissance, or rather, an awakening. Because Fire Emblem Awakening did not sell 250,000 copies. It sold 2.3 million, making it the best-selling 3DS game that didn't have Mario, Pokemon, or Link in it. Though controversial for a couple reasons in the fandom, the big one being it introduced casual mode, supposedly anyway. For series veterans, it returned a lot of elements that had been missing. Child characters, it was the first to reintroduce. It finally got us to return to the first world of Mystery of the Emblem and Gaiden, see what happened to the continents they took place in, their descendants, and deliver a happy ending to the people who've been fighting Grima for generations. And of course, had the first Avatar character, which, love it, hate it, has influenced the franchise ever since. Now, the fan base was divided, although much grown. So, was Awakening the savior or destroyer of the franchise? Join any Fire Emblem fan forum or website or even Facebook groups, and inevitably this will be an argument that pops up every other week. Do we hate Awakening, or do we love it? And to me, all these arguments are pointless. We should love it for one reason alone. It is the entire reason we got more Fire Emblem. Believe me, I know some people who would cut off fingers to get a new Golden Sun. But it saved the franchise, and whether or not you liked Fates or Awakening or Three Houses, Fire Emblem's like pizza. as long as there's more, it's good. Now, the other thing is, of course, the Japanese fan base provides an interesting contrast here. We may think Awakening ruined the franchise, but they think the Game Boy games, because they introduced those awful Americans to the franchise. So the people who say Awakening ruined the franchise, do keep in mind there are Fire Emblem fans somewhere in the world who think the same thing of you. It's a big fandom. We're all welcome in it. Even the people who like Fates. Now, Awakening was not the first game to have casual mode. Does anybody know what was?
I think it was Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon for the Nintendo DS.
You already got a book and a snack, right?
Yes.
Well, he's right, though. Give him a round of applause.
That game, Shadow Dragon, that was my introduction to the franchise.
And all the more reason we should celebrate them introducing something like that. Because, look, I love Permadeath as a mechanic, for reasons we'll get to in a bit, but there's no denying casual mode opened up the game to a whole lot of new gamers, and if you just want the story, you can come for the story, and you're missing out if you don't like the stories, so I get the appeal there. There's something for everybody. And the Awakening era, as we're still calling it, because we're still mostly in that era it influenced, has given us a wealth of interesting Fire Emblem games. Of course, we had Awakening, we had Fates, the bad one, Fire Emblem Echoes, Shadows of Valentia, which I hope Nintendo has learned some lessons from, because that is how we should look at the older games in the franchise. And of course, Three Houses, which did some marvelous things in its own right. Mostly because it's Fire Emblem Fates done well. As I say, I love the Fates fan base, I liked the games, but why settle for the 7 when you're surrounded by 10s? Now, this era has been defined by the beautiful 3D visuals, full voice acting, and for the most part, the mechanics are the same they've ever been, even if they've been fine-tuned to the point they sing. You do get changes occasionally. I do like the fact the last 2 games have had that full voice acting. I like reading text as much as the next guy, but sometimes you just want to listen. And, of course, it's been very, very lucrative for Nintendo. Who here has played Fire Emblem Heroes? Who here has paid money to play Fire Emblem Heroes?
No.
Wow, we actually have some hands raised this time. Kudos, because you have made Fire Emblem somewhere near $500 million for Nintendo. So you have all but secured we will never join Star Fox, F-Zero, and all those other franchises in the garbage bin. So thank you. Also, if you just want to throw money at people for no reason, you know. But it brought these, and it also had the boom of Smash characters. Of course, it's 8 now. Ironically, for those of here who may have been at the 2020 panel, I predicted Byleth would be introduced into Smash. You're welcome, or I'm sorry, depending on your view. But why has Fire Emblem stuck around for 30 years, though? Excellent timing is the big thing. It hit American shores right as fantasy and anime were both booming, and this is a franchise baptized in both. They've had a really remarkable string of quality. As much as I may insult Fates, it is out of love, there isn't really a bad game in the franchise. And usually, they're all great. And there are a few other things. They have a cast of hundreds. If there's a character or an archetype you like, odds are good there are a half dozen Fire Emblem characters that meet that archetype. We all know and love some of them. The magical albino, the crappy archer, the lecherous guy, the flirtatious girl. There's something for everybody. They've got interesting characters, backstories, goals, hopes, dreams, and you get to know them as the games go on, and that's honestly one of the best things about these games. You get to know each of the soldiers fighting alongside you. And they all have something to love, except Edelgard. People who choose that team, I am sorry. I did not spend 2 decades of Fire Emblem games fighting against world-conquering tyrants just to side with one because she's pretty. But the thing is, you've got dozens of characters per game, so there's someone to love for every fan. The other thing is, and I say this as a veteran, it is one of the best representations of military life in all of video games. Movies and video games generally do a pretty awful job of it. We all know the first-person cover shooter where everybody's more jacked than Arnold Schwarzenegger, everything's a various shade of brown, and that's not what military life is like. You will never find a more diverse bunch of generally young people than your average military unit, and Fire Emblem actually does a really good job of copying that. Shockingly, the game that has you lead a bunch of child soldiers into combat is more realistic than most Call of Duty games. Who knew? But they also really nail, and this is where that character interaction comes into play, the banter and brotherhood between them. You see your soldiers commiserating with how much they hate the conditions, how much they miss home, hopes for what they do after the war. And again, that youth is a major element of it. Again, Fire Emblem gets a lot of grief from people who don't like the franchise for being the franchise where a bunch of pretty anime boys and girls in their teens overwhelm a planet-conquering dictatorship. Thing is, that is way more accurate to history than most of them would like to acknowledge. Case in point. Here's where the trivia starts getting tricky. What is the average age number for members of the military under the age of 25?
Enlisted or SEAL?
Enlisted. Let's just go.
$1 million?
No, but you know what? You took a swing. You deserve a reward. Come on up, get a book and a snack.
Oh, I already got a book.
Oh, well,
Is it in the millions?
half.
Okay, I was gonna say, I think it's like, isn't it like 300,000 or something like that?
Double it.
600,000?
Come on up, get a book and a snack. Nearly half of all U.S. military personnel are under the age of 25. 600,000 of them, in fact. If you go to 30, it's close to 70 to 80%, depending on the service branch. And historically, we're actually at the oldest our military has ever been. In World War II, the people storming the beaches of Normandy and Iwo Jima, the average age was 20. Civil War, 24. The American Revolution, 22. And for our tourists in the area, there is a lovely cemetery across the Potomac with a lot of men who never lived to see 25. The most decorated soldier in American history was a 17-year-old named Audie Murphy, who, by the age of 19, had won every single medal the Allied military had to give him. And to rope it back to Fire Emblem, the localization team say he was one of the inspirations for Donald in Fire Emblem Awakening. The young man from Texas influenced the cowboy with a pot on his head. Interesting way to pay tribute, but I love it. The other interesting way it reflects military life in an interesting way, finding love on the battlefield. As much as it's made fun of, that is very realistic. Dating back to the thespians of ancient Greece to the, let's just say, ornery young men and women of the military today. We love you guys. Soldiers have been flirting almost as much as they've been fighting since the inception of warfare. Of course, it's not love that makes Fire Emblem really strike its core of getting what real-life warfare is like. It's death. The oldest signature of the franchise, probably what it's most famous for, Permadeath. It's probably the most important thing, because this is where all that character development, camaraderie, the love you have for these characters becomes a knife they stick right between your ribs. Let's just say you got outnumbered, you made a careless movement, you got outplanned, outgunned. Maybe you just got unlucky, and your favorite unit has their health dropped to 0. They utter out a last line of dialogue, how much they want to go home or how much they don't want to die here, and then they're gone. That hits like a bombshell every single time it happens, doesn't it? And one of the things that's really powerful about that is they really do know how to twist that knife repeatedly. There are lines from some of these characters when they die I have never forgotten years later. And the thing that makes it really rub salt in that wound is it is your fault. The problem many tactical RPGs have, and many war games and tactics games in general, is that death is cheap. You can Zerg rush your opponents to victory. You can just build a giant unit stack of death. Or as the meme says, some of you may die. That's a cost I'm willing to pay. Even other tactical RPGs, Advance Wars, unit dies? Who cares? I'll make another one. You don't have that luxury in Fire Emblem. These are people with faces, names, goals, dreams. And you spend them cheaply, well, I hope you're okay with paying that price. Even games that try to be respectful with death. F. It comes across as hollow many times. And that's the real Fire Emblem difference, is they really nail the pain, the trauma of death and warfare. Every move matters. Every soldier matters. And the biggest choice they give everyone is what kind of commander you want to be. Are you the one whose men will follow you into hell because they trust you will lead them out safely to the other side? Or the one who will march over the bones of your own men to victory? That is the choice that faces every commander. And that is the choice Fire Emblem puts directly in your hands. You are playing chess with human lives. Are they pawns or your friends? Spend accordingly. But it also digs way deeper than that. And this is one thing Three Houses, I think, did better than any other game in the franchise, is that it really delves into the trauma of warfare. Most games do a very awful job at this. Who here's played Spec Ops: The Line? Wow. Okay, couple more hands, good. First, good taste. Sorry, you don't get a snack for it. But I love the game, but its portrayal of PTSD plays into some of the biggest stereotypes of the disorder. And that's kind of a problem because those stereotypes cause harm in the real world. What has been the leading cause of death for members of the military since 2011? Coming up, get a snack and a book. We have lost more soldiers to suicide in the past decade than we have to combat. It is the second leading cause of death among veterans. 22 a day, as the stereotype goes. I say stereotype because the actual number is 27. And part of the reason that is so horrible is that we have a pitiful understanding of PTSD as a mental disorder. We only considered it a mental disorder starting in 1980. We still don't know a lot of the root causes, traumas, but the stereotypes cause real harm to this day. Just across the river in Virginia, there was a veteran healthcare center that was to be built somewhere in northern Virginia where the locals protested until it stopped because they thought, hey, they're treating vets with PTSD here. They'll kill my children. Fire Emblem, meanwhile, actually nails the traumas of warfare, of death, of having to kill your fellow man. One of the most powerful moments in Three Houses is when you send them into combat the first time, and each of your units reacts a different way. Some with grim acceptance, some with revulsion, some with utter horror at having to do it. And doing it again and again begins to affect them. One of my favorite examples, Dorothea, everybody's favorite flirtatious songstress / JoJo reference. By the second half of the game, she has gone from the lighthearted wink and a nudge character to this broken, sad shell of a person. My first time playing through the game, I loved that one mission where you get to drive a sword through Ferdinand's face. And then you get back to the base. Mr. Ferdinand von Aegir, I'm Ferdinand von Aegir. And then Dorothea's sad. Ferdy was our friend. We killed Ferdy. What happened, Professor? And your heart just breaks. Dozens of moments of like that throughout the franchise. Even the epilogues are no guarantee of a happy ending, and that's probably the saddest reality of many war stories. They don't end with the war. A lot of people don't manage to come back. They commit suicide, they drink, and so do many of the characters in these games. There are multiple character epilogues where your characters will die as mercenaries post-war. Some commit suicide. And the biggest way that you probably guarantee they don't is friendship, of all things. Those bonds, they come back and be valuable, and that is perhaps the most important detail they could have put in. Because this is very true to life. The best way to guarantee somebody who has experienced these traumas comes back as a whole person is to be there for them. That's one of the reasons I love Dimitri. He is probably the best portrayal of PTSD in gaming. He is not a maniac because he was born that way or because he's bloodlust. He's that way because he was abandoned by his friends. The one timeline where he's actually sane from the start, ironically, is the one where he's your enemy and all his friends stayed by his side. And the one where he recovers is the Blue Lions route, where all of his friends are still there for him, where you're there for him, and eventually he begins the long road to recovery. And that's very true. Because what pulls people out of that spiral of depression, trauma, PTSD, is that we're all in this together. The best thing we have as a weapon against people who've seen the terrors of war, be they the soldier, the warrior, the widow, the refugee, the best weapon we have is our compassion. But we're getting a bit grim, aren't we? Let's end this on a high note, shall we? What is the future of Fire Emblem? Oh, I wonder how that image got there. We're probably a couple years out, if not 3 or 4, from the next Fire Emblem game. My guess is the next one will probably be a remake. I'm okay with that, especially if it's as good as Valentia was. I would love to have something set in Elbay, or to bring back Genealogy and Thracia 776 so we could get that child character mechanic back. Give you a reason to experiment with pairings and whatnot. You want your Roy to have a bonus against dragons? Pair off Elowood with Ninian. You want him to have higher crits? Pair off with Lyn. If you're going to have a eugenics simulator, do it right, with pretty anime people. But it would be a great way to remaster some of those old games, and if Nintendo refuses to sell them, the least they could do is offer it a way that we could get them today. Of course, there's also spin-offs. If we really are done with Smash, I would love to see something like a Soul Calibur-style weapons fighter in Fire Emblem. Maybe another Warriors game. I didn't like the Persona spin-off, but I know plenty of people did. More power to you. Because that is an interesting thing. Fire Emblem's going in some really interesting places, and it is increasingly influenced by us, the American fan base. The biggest way you see that is, again, with the concession they made with the main characters in Three Houses. The big two, you have your magical green and your magical albino, Edelgard, your blue and or green-haired sword person in Byleth, but the two other protagonists were made with us in mind. You have Dimitri, who looks like every single American character in every anime ever. And you have Claude, who is notable for being the first non-Eurasian character to be a main character in series history. They're both interesting in that regard, but it's no small thing that a Japanese game had a non-white and or Asian protagonist. And they gave the two of them the game's biggest arcs. And they did that with us in mind. But the best weapon Fire Emblem has, you, the most devoted fans in gaming, in my opinion. Who else could come in at the tail end of MAGFest and rather than going home, listen to my ugly mug talk about this game for an hour? Who else could support a franchise where half the franchise isn't legal to be purchased in America? Who puts together those beautiful cosplays not even just gaming conventions, you see Fire Emblem character dress-ups at anime conventions, sci-fi conventions. That is how big and expansive the fan base has grown. We have taken what was once the side project of a couple designers at Nintendo and turned it into an A-tier franchise for Nintendo. So as long as we continue loving and supporting this franchise, sky's the limit. Really, that's the best message Fire Emblem could send. That with the right friends by your side, no mission is impossible. Now here is where I do have to plug my employer, who's giving away many of these lovely books. Over 100 of our books are free on our website, so if you do want some free reading for the ride or the plane ride home, Bane.com. Our free library has over 100 that you get for free, because like all good pushers, we understand your first taste should be on the house. And of course, if you haven't gotten tired of hearing me give my opinion about things, just look around there. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, pretty much everything you see there. But before I let you beautiful people return home, anybody have any questions, comments, even just a favorite Fire Emblem moment they'd like to share? Yes, you first, then you.
So this isn't exactly Fire Emblem, but it is about one of the topics that you had in your presentation. What other game that is not like a Fire Emblem franchise do you think had an accurate representation of war or trauma in the gaming industry?
Honestly, that's tough, because war, you actually do get some good stuff. Like, Spec Ops does an awful thing with portraying PTSD, but it nails how awful war is up close. I'll give it that. A lot of RPGs actually do really well with trauma, because you get more time with the characters. It's not just throwing you in one environment after the other, but honestly, I think the best places are where you look for the unconventional places. First-person shooters have a formula they like to stick to, so they don't get to explore that a lot. A lot of RPGs do. Yeah?
I just have to mention that I made an expensive purchasing decision and bought Path of Radiance here at MAGFest.
First, congratulations on your Bitcoin fortune. But second, that is an excellent purchase, and one of the many reasons I hope Nintendo does re-release these games in some form or another. You shouldn't have to pay $200 to play some of these games.
$250 actually.
Oh, good God.
It had the manuals and inserts.
Oh, big spender, big spender.
This kind of has an anecdote about Path of Radiance. I saw someone selling it to GameStop, and you know that they got like $5 for that, and then they went and sold it for $250. So
Oh, good God.
probably one of the most painful things I've ever experienced.
Friends don't let friends buy or sell things from GameStop. Remember that, dear people.
I have an anecdote that might brighten the tone. It's very similar. My roommate from college meant to give one of the Path of Radiance to GameStop, and I think he got like some money for it. But it was actually only the box. He still had the disc, and he was wiser by the time he went to actually sell that. I think he sold that one off on the black market for a much bigger sum.
Well, I'm happy he found fortune if he had to give up the game. Anything else? Oh, one more.
I'll go with one more. So I do have a confession to make. I haven't played a lot of Fire Emblem.
Everybody starts somewhere.
Kill me. The only Fire Emblem game that I've actually played was the one with Lynn and Hector and Eloyd. Yeah, I played on an emulator on my phone. Which
Oh.
Fire Emblem games did I play?
Well, they're all actually a pretty good place to start, but if I had to pick just one or two, are you looking for one for your phone or one for a legal Nintendo system?
Anything.
Awakening is probably a good place to start if you have a 3DS. Three Houses, honestly, is fantastic, but if you're looking for ones on your phone, the Game Boy games are a good one. Sacred Stone is probably the best of the Game Boy games. Again, I cannot condone or condemn people who sail the high seas, but there are some great translations of Genealogy of the Holy War. Any of those are a great place to start, but find one you like, stick with it, and the rest will grow on you.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Of course.
Watch out for Fire Emblem 6. It's brutal.
You, then you.
What are your favorite 3 gameplay mechanics from the Fire Emblem series?
Permadeath, the character A, B, C, D trees, and you know, I'm gonna confess, I do like the ability to turn the various ways they give you to take back turns. Just because, let's face it, even if you do play with Permadeath on, as I do, you're just gonna turn off the damn thing and restart. You're just saving yourself more time.
I didn't want to be the one to say it when you were like, getting real deep about death and all that, but then it was like, or you just turn back time and we're all.
From a gameplay perspective, it just saves you the restart time.
It also means you don't be a masochist when playing that.
Fair enough.
going off of gameplay mechanics, what you feel about the change from the weapons triangle?
I don't know. On one hand, I get why they had it in there. But on the other hand, if you're making a realistic warfare game, there is no reason a spear, axe, and sword shouldn't be mutually effective against each other. It was a limitation on the games back when they needed more limitations. Now you have skills, mechanics, a dozen different new ones. So I think maybe we have evolved past the weapons triangle, although I do get the people who say they miss it.
It's still kind of there. You have like Spear Breaker on some of
Yeah.
It's not totally gone. You can remove it if you want to.
Right.
So, I don't know how official sources are, but there's been a lot of talk about there's going to be some sort of Fire Emblem revealed this year. I'm guessing probably around March or April, because those are like Fire Emblem months. But I don't know what it is, but that's just what I've heard. There's some things coming sooner rather than later.
Well, your lips to Nintendo's ears, because like I said, so long as there's more Fire Emblem, we're all that much the richer for it. And certainly, there's no shortage of people that would buy it. So, well, if that's all, thank you for coming to my panel. Thank you for spending your final hours at MAGFest with my ugly face. But if I can ask two things from you guys. First, I've still got some books, I've still got some snacks. Don't make me take them back to my car. And second, if I can just get a picture of that crowd with you guys hanging anybody who got those books. So, first things first. Everybody say Fire Emblem.
Fire Emblem.